Hi everybody. We're going to spend a little bit of time in Module 3 thinking about ethics and the relationship between ethics and sort of the overarching perspectives of leadership. We're continuing on from where we left off in last class, and we're going to take a bit of a look at Spivak's work. Spivak is kind of an important cultural theorist. She's well known in international development, peace studies, and cultural theory. And so a number of us use her work, particularly those of us who came from OISE or who studied under folks from OISE. And she contributes some really important information, telling us about these relationships between processes at sort of the international level, and then we can think about how they might influence our role as leaders in organizations or within the context of movements. So I hope you'll find this information valuable. I realize it's a bit of a challenging article to read, and certainly when I was reading her work initially, I was reading it kind of line by line. But I think it's worth the energy and the effort, and that hopefully you'll get something out of it. We'll start with definitions as we always do, and Spivak gives us a few important definitions in the article. She talks about the relationship between defining complex terms like the notion of rights by contrasting it against what we might understand as its opposing perspective. And so in this case, wrongs. So she talks about the idea, or speaks about the idea, or writes about the idea that the notion of rights is a complex term, and it requires a bunch of definitions, and that defining rights really requires the contrast of wrong. It's hard to hold on to the concept of rights if we don't also have the bordering concept of wrongs as a way of understanding the difference between these two phenomena. So Spivak invites us to think about rights and wrongs, not only in terms of the concept of correct or good or desirable, and incorrect and undesirable, but also in terms of the notion of human rights, which is an area of social work that has gained a lot of traction in contemporary times. So we talk a lot about clients' rights and human rights as fundamental benefits and resources that individuals and groups of individuals have a right to, drawing really on those liberal humanist notions that by virtue of being human, you have the right to the things that you need in order to be able to actualize your full potential. And we know that in a social context, in a Canadian context, we don't really provide people with the things that they need in order to reach their full potential, but rather we provide them with some resources in order to be able to sustain the necessities of life, or what has come to be known as the necessaries of life, which is a bit of a different term. So Spivak reminds us that when we talk about rights, we have to have a subject. We have to have a sanctioned being who's understood as existing in order to be able to access that notion of rights. And so that person can be understood or recognized, or that subject can be understood or recognized in terms of both the individual and the collective. So we have rights as individuals, but we also have collective sets of rights. And so she invites us to think about the notion of human rights as this process of claiming a set of opportunities, a set of benefits, a set of standards that is understood to displace or correct something. And so in order for us to understand the notion of what people are entitled to through human rights, we also have to understand what it is that they're missing, or what it is that they do not have, or that they lack. However, she says when we think about wrongs, wrongs don't necessarily require that subject, that person who is called into being through the process of being entitled to rights. That wrongs can be understood simply as a descriptive concept that aren't possessed by anything. So wrongs kind of almost float around and attach themselves to various environments or circumstances, whereas rights require a subject in order to be brought into being. In social work, we're really concerned with these subjective beings who are accessing rights because, generally speaking, they're the people that we're concerned with or the clients that we're providing resources to. They might also be the staff or the group of social workers that we're concerned with as managers, or if we're operating within the context of a social movement, they're the target of the intervention that we're engaging in order to make some kind of systemic or policy change. And so we're also concerned with these subjective beings who are entitled to rights. And so we depend a lot on notions of defining what is wrong and what needs to be corrected in order to do our work as social workers to correct these particular situations or lacking statuses. So Spivak also invites us to think about kind of the challenge within this. And I don't think the ideas that she presents are particularly new to you, but she does it in a very eloquent and deep way. So she invites us to think about this idea that acting on wrongs brings with it a kind of neo-colonial process, something that she describes as social Darwinism, in that there has to be someone who makes an assessment of right and wrong and who engages in some kind of action or intervention in order to resolve the situation that is wrong and produce a right. Whether that's a right that is understood as a human right, something that is inseparable from the individual or from the subject or from the collective. And so she invites us to think about who it is that finds themselves in a position where they're able to assess right and wrong, and who it is that is able to decide what it is that resolves that right or that wrong. She suggests that there is often a kind of agenda within these actions of intervention, and that often there are particular social norms and identities that are understood as preferred, and that producing subjects that reflect those kinds of perspectives is part of the agenda of making right when you find something that's wrong. So she talks about the idea that there is perhaps a kind of a xenophobia, maybe a white supremacy that exists within discourses around human rights and making right, and that we should be cautious when we kind of take up this mantle of human rights uncritically, because there are many harms that we may actually be inflicting in the process of right making. And we can think about what that might mean for social work leaders. What is it exactly that you're promoting as the right thing to do or the right way to be? And what are you losing in the process of making the opposite wrong? In many ways, this slide reinforces what I said in the previous slide, in that some of the discourses, some of the arguments, some of the perspectives that we use, or the taken for granted assumptions that we use when we're engaging in the process of acting as a social worker or acting as a social work leadership, are often imbued with particular kinds of supremacy, white supremacy, and now I see there's a typo, it shouldn't be wild supremacy, it should be white supremacy, within the context of social work practice, that oftentimes social workers are promoting particular kinds of value systems and particular kinds of actions that represent those value systems, that we're often, focused really more on social upward mobility for people than we are with human rights or social justice, and that we should be cautious of finding ourselves in a position where there are assumptions made about our own identity and our role in the process of making these kinds of normalizing activities a part of our work. She suggests that many human rights and development activities have an agenda, and that it's not really simply about benevolence, but rather it's about developing a particular kind of society that includes particular kinds of processes. They might be economic, they might be military, or they might be political. So we could be talking about capitalism, we could be talking about a kind of imperial militarization, or we could be talking about normative notions of democracy that reflect kind of Western perspectives on how one engages in debate and how one brings governmental power into being, knowing that voting isn't really simply the only way that democracy is expressed. Spivak invites us to think about colonization and the ways in which contemporary notions of development might be understood as a form of colonization. So we can certainly understand that when we think about international development work, but it might also be worthwhile thinking about things like gentrification. What constitutes a good neighborhood or a nice neighborhood? And what happens to the people who are displaced, who are excluded from being part of that nice neighborhood? So it might be great to be able to purchase a house that you can afford, move from Toronto to Hamilton, buy a little house and renovate it into something that you can call your own. But what effect or influence does that have on the neighborhood, and how does it change it? And why does that make it a better neighborhood than the neighborhood it was before? So we have to think about these processes and what it is that we're encouraging. Similarly, we might think about how we do that within people's lives, or how we do that within families when we introduce particular kinds of activities or understandings or perspectives on self or set of feelings that as social workers we are suggesting are better than the ones that exist there before. Spivak invites us to think about notions of colonialism and how they relate to contemporary processes of human rights creation and the elimination of wrongs. She uses the example of Doctors Without Borders and the way in which Doctors Without Borders and other international development organizations use local people in the field in order to do work to help other local people access the resources that are available through that particular organization. And so when we translate the term Doctors Without Borders, in the original French term, the phrase is actually frontiers. And we might want to think about the difference between a border, which is fixed, and a frontier, which is more liminal. So frontiers are the spaces where one particular ecology, whether that's a social ecology or a physical ecology, shifts and moves into another kind of physical ecology. We could understand that as the space between nation states. We could understand that in terms of spaces between urban and rural settings. We could understand that in terms of spaces between, say, an ocean front area and a landlocked area. So it's not usually an abrupt change like a border, but rather a more liminal shift. And so she invites us to think about the way in which we might be using people or perspectives or understandings from a local area to help people access particular resources or feel comfortable with particular shifts and changes in the way that they engage in practices. And so we might think about things like how social work leaders might use social workers from an organization to introduce a new model of treatment or a new approach to practice. If we think about some of the large recording packages that were introduced into agencies like child welfare agencies and mental health institutions, oftentimes social workers from within the institution were trained as trainers and then trained their colleagues on the use and application of the software or the application of a particular method like solution-focused therapy. And that oftentimes the idea of someone local who introduces a new concept makes it more easy for people to accept that new concept and to potentially not question as severely as they might if it was an outsider or a stranger who was introducing that new method or approach. And so as social work leaders, we might want to think about what that means in terms of the decisions that we make when we are introducing new perspectives, and how we might use those approaches to influence people for good or for bad. So, if we think about this idea of human rights and the righting of wrongs, well, there's certainly some good that comes out of innovation and creating change for people. I mean, we want to solve the pandemic. But in the process of solving the pandemic, we may cause some difficulty or some harm to people. So, in quarantining people, we're producing some good for some people and some real harms for others. If we look at the effect on the homeless population, then we know that our solution to this problem has created another set of problems that we haven't really introduced too many solutions for. So she invites us to think about how these notions of human rights and righting wrongs may appear very innocent at face value, but when we start to scratch underneath the surface, there may be other agendas at play. And that as social work leadership participants, as people who have an interest in leadership and perhaps want to be leaders, we might need to think about how we can influence these processes and help to produce the best possible goods, and that those notions of best possible goods might not come from us in our role as leadership, but rather might come from below us or beside us, or in some cases even above us, and that questioning what the hidden agenda might be in the process of righting wrongs may be part of the work of leadership, and at times resisting or not making as easy those processes might also be part of the work that we do. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts, whether you've seen this kind of thing in your own experience, how you might negotiate it as social work leaders. I've asked some questions on Flipgrid, and I'm going to look forward to hearing you discuss these topics over the next couple of days. Bye for now.